The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval pier as cameras rolled and thousands of families waited in perfect silence. What they were about to witness would break every protocol, challenge every tradition, and reveal a truth that the military had tried to hide for decades. Sarah Chen had walked this same dock hundreds of times as a Navy medic, but today felt different. Today she carried the weight of a secret that could destroy careers, end friendships, and change everything the public thought they knew about America's most elite fighting force. The brass had made their position clear. She would walk that dock alone, bearing the shame they believed she deserved. But what they didn't know was that 37 Navy SEALs had made a different decision, a decision that would be captured on live television and shared across the world within hours. As Sarah took her first step onto the weathered planks, she had no idea that behind her, one by one, the most feared warriors in the world were quietly falling into formation. What happened next would expose a cover-up that reached the highest levels of command and reveal the true meaning of brotherhood in the face of injustice. This is the story of how one woman's courage and the honor of America's elite warriors brought down a system built on silence and changed military culture forever.
Sarah Chen never imagined that saving a life would cost her everything she had worked for.
The daughter of Taiwanese immigrants, she had joined the Navy at 18 with dreams of becoming a doctor.
Her parents had sacrificed everything to come to America, working double shifts in their small restaurant to pay for her education. When Sarah chose military service over medical school, they didn't understand that they supported her anyway. 5 years later, Sarah had earned her place as one of the most respected medics in the Pacific Fleet. She had trained with special operations units, completed advanced trauma courses, and had been handpicked for assignments that most medics could only dream of. Her small stature and quiet demeanor often fooled people into underestimating her. But those who worked with her knew better. Sarah Chen could keep someone alive under conditions that would break most people. The incident that would change everything happened on a routine training exercise in the Philippines. Team Alpha, a squad of Navy SEALs, was conducting underwater demolitions training when something went catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, a decorated veteran with 15 years of service, surfaced from a dive unconscious and not breathing. His diving partner, Petty Officer First Class David Rodriguez, was screaming for help as he struggled to keep Webb's head above water. Sarah was monitoring the exercise from the support boat when she heard Rodriguez's calls for help. Without hesitation, she dove into the choppy waters, still wearing her boots and utility uniform. The weight of her gear pulled her down, but she fought against it, swimming harder than she ever had in her life. When she reached Webb, he was blue around the lips and completely unresponsive. Working in the water while trying to stay afloat, Sarah cleared Webb's airway and began rescue breathing. She could taste salt water and diesel fuel as waves crashed over them, but she never stopped. Rodriguez helped support Webb's body while Sarah worked, and together they managed to get the unconscious SEAL back to the boat. Once on deck, Sarah's real work began. Webb had no pulse, and his pupils were fixed and dilated. She immediately started CPR, pushing hard and fast on his chest while shouting orders to the boat crew. Someone called for the helicopter, but Sarah knew they didn't have time to wait. Every second that passed without circulation meant more brain damage. For 12 minutes, Sarah worked on Webb while the boat raced toward shore. She alternated between chest compressions and rescue breathing, occasionally checking for a pulse that wasn't there. The other SEALs on the boat watched in tense silence as the small medic fought to bring their teammate back from the edge of death. Then, just as the harbor came into view, Webb suddenly gasped, and his eyes fluttered open. His pulse came back weak but steady, and he began breathing on his own. The relief on the boat was overwhelming, and several of the hardened SEALs had tears in their eyes as they helped transfer Webb to the waiting ambulance. Webb spent 3 days in intensive care, but he made a full recovery. The doctors said that Sarah's quick action and persistent CPR had saved his life. If she had hesitated even for a few seconds, or if she had given up during those critical 12 minutes, Webb would have died or suffered permanent brain damage. The rescue should have been the highlight of Sarah's career. Instead, it became the beginning of her nightmare. 3 weeks after the incident, Sarah was called into the office of Captain James Morrison, the commanding officer of the base. Morrison was a stern man with graying hair and cold blue eyes who had a reputation for running a tight ship. Morrison didn't waste time with pleasantries. He informed Sarah that she was being charged with conduct unbecoming of a Navy petty officer. The charges centered around her decision to enter the water without proper diving equipment and her alleged failure to follow proper rescue protocols. Morrison claimed that Sarah had endangered herself and potentially compromised the rescue operation. Sarah was stunned. She had saved Webb's life, and now she was being punished for it. When she tried to explain her actions, Morrison cut her off. He told her that discipline and following orders were the foundation of military service, and that heroics had no place in the modern Navy. The message was clear. She should have waited for properly equipped rescue divers, even if it meant Webb might have died. The charges were serious enough to end Sarah's career and potentially result in a court-martial. She was immediately removed from special operations duty and assigned to routine medical tasks at the base clinic. The SEALs she had trained with were no longer allowed to work with her, and many of her colleagues began treating her differently. What Sarah didn't know at the time was that there was more to the story. Captain Morrison had been under investigation by naval intelligence for several months before the incident. There were allegations of financial irregularities in the base's contracting procedures, and Morrison was desperate to deflect attention from his own problems. Sarah's rescue of Webb had brought unwanted scrutiny to the training exercise and the base's safety procedures. Morrison saw an opportunity to create a distraction and demonstrate his commitment to military discipline. By making an example of Sarah, he could show his superiors that he was in complete control of his command. The decision to charge Sarah was also influenced by her gender and ethnicity. Morrison came from an old-school military background where women were not welcome in combat roles, and he particularly resented Asian American service members whom he viewed as outsiders. He had made several comments over the years that suggested he didn't believe women belonged in the military, especially not in positions where they worked closely with special operations units. Morrison's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes, had privately objected to the charges against Sarah. Hayes had reviewed the incident report and spoken with witnesses, and she believed that Sarah had acted appropriately under the circumstances. However, when Hayes tried to voice her concerns, Morrison made it clear that her own career could be at risk if she didn't support his decision. As news of the charges spread through the base, reaction was mixed. Some of the older officers supported Morrison, believing that military discipline required strict adherence to protocols regardless of the outcome. They argued that allowing service members to make independent decisions in crisis situations could lead to chaos and breakdown of the chain of command. However, many of the younger service members, especially those who had worked with Sarah, were outraged. They knew her character and her capabilities, and they couldn't understand how saving a life could be considered misconduct. The SEALs who had witnessed the rescue were particularly angry that they were warned not to speak publicly about the case. Webb himself was placed in an impossible position. He owed his life to Sarah, but speaking out in her defense could end his own career. The Navy had invested millions of dollars in his training, and he had a wife and 2 young children to support. When reporters tried to interview him about the incident, he was ordered to refer all questions to the Public Affairs Office. Sarah's parents were devastated when they learned about the charges. They had always been proud of their daughter's service, and they couldn't understand how the American military could punish someone for saving a life. Her father, who had served briefly in the Taiwanese military before immigrating, was particularly upset. He had taught Sarah that honor and duty were more important than personal safety, and he couldn't comprehend a system that would punish those values. As Sarah prepared to fight the charges, she realized that she was facing more than just a military legal proceeding. She was challenging a system that valued conformity over courage and protocol over human life. The stakes couldn't be higher. Her career, her reputation, and her faith in the institution she had sworn to serve were all on the line. The case attracted attention from military legal experts and veterans advocacy groups, but Sarah felt more alone than ever. She had joined the Navy to serve her country and help others, and now she was being treated like a criminal for doing exactly that. The irony was not lost on her that the same actions that had saved Webb's life were now threatening to destroy her own future. Unknown to Sarah, the SEALs who had witnessed her heroism were quietly organizing their own response to the injustice they were witnessing. Led by Senior Chief Petty Officer Thomas Tank Martinez, a veteran of multiple deployments who commanded enormous respect within the SEAL community, they were planning something unprecedented. Martinez had served with distinction for over 20 years, and he had never seen anything like what was happening to Sarah. He knew that the charges were politically motivated, and he was determined not to let a good sailor be sacrificed to protect a corrupt officer's career. What he was planning would violate protocol and potentially end his own career, but Martinez had never backed down from a fight, especially when it involved defending someone who couldn't defend themselves. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the very foundations of military justice and honor. Sarah Chen had no idea that her darkest hour was about to become the moment that would define not just her own future, but the future of military culture itself. The military legal system moved slowly, but the court of public opinion was already forming its verdict. 3 weeks after the charges were filed, leaked details of Sarah's case began appearing in military blogs and social media. Someone had anonymously posted the incident report along with witness statements, and the story spread like wildfire through the veteran community. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's assigned defense counsel, was a sharp young lawyer who specialized in military justice cases. Walsh had graduated at the top of her class from the Naval Academy and earned her law degree from Georgetown before joining the Judge Advocate General's Corps. She was known for her thorough preparation and aggressive courtroom style, but even she was shocked by the weakness of the case against Sarah. Walsh spent hours reviewing the evidence and interviewing witnesses. Every person she spoke with told the same story. Sarah Chen had acted heroically to save Webb's life, and her actions had been completely appropriate under the circumstances. The rescue had been textbook perfect, and Webb would almost certainly have died without Sarah's immediate intervention. The more Walsh investigated, the more she became convinced that the charges against Sarah were not really about military protocol or safety procedures. There were too many inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, and Captain Morrison's behavior during the investigation raised serious red flags. Walsh discovered that Morrison had personally interviewed all the witnesses before the formal investigation began, and several of them reported feeling pressured to modify their statements. Petty Officer Rodriguez, who had been in the water with Webb when the incident occurred, told Walsh that Morrison had suggested his memory of events might be cloudy due to the stress of the situation. Even more troubling was Walsh's discovery that Morrison had initially recommended Sarah for a Navy Commendation Medal for her actions during the rescue. The recommendation had been written and submitted to higher command just days after the incident, praising Sarah's quick thinking and selfless courage in the face of extreme danger. Only after Morrison learned that the incident had attracted the attention of naval intelligence did he reverse course and file charges instead. Walsh also uncovered evidence of Morrison's ongoing financial troubles. The captain was facing mounting legal bills from a messy divorce, and his ex-wife was demanding substantial alimony payments. There were rumors that Morrison had been taking kickbacks from defense contractors, and naval intelligence was reportedly building a case against him. The timing of the charges against Sarah suggested that Morrison was trying to create a distraction and demonstrate his commitment to military discipline. By taking a hard line against a subordinate, he could show his superiors that he was focused on command responsibilities rather than personal problems. Meanwhile, Senior Chief Martinez was conducting his own investigation among the SEAL community. Martinez had served with some of the most decorated warriors in the Navy, and he knew how to read between the lines of official reports.
What he found convinced him that Sarah was being railroaded by a corrupt officer who was trying to save his own career.
Martinez began reaching out to his network of current and former SEALs, sharing the details of Sarah's case and asking for their support.
The response was overwhelming and unanimous. The charges against Sarah were an affront to military honor and had to be opposed. The SEALs were particularly outraged because they understood the split-second decisions required in life-or-death situations. They had all faced moments when following protocol would have meant letting people die, and they knew that Sarah had done exactly what any of them would have done in the same situation. Word of Martinez's informal campaign reached other special operations units, and soon Navy EOD technicians, Army Rangers, and Marine Force recon operators were expressing their support for Sarah. A Facebook page called Support Petty Officer Chen attracted thousands of followers within days, and donations began pouring in to help fund her legal defense. The growing public attention put pressure on Navy leadership to resolve the case quickly. Admiral Robert Clark, the commander of Pacific Fleet, ordered his own review of the charges and the circumstances surrounding them. Clark was a respected officer who had worked his way up from enlisted ranks, and he had little patience for the kind of political games that Morrison was playing. Clark's review uncovered additional evidence of Morrison's misconduct. Financial records showed suspicious patterns in the base's contracting procedures, and several contractors reported being pressured to inflate invoices and kick back portions of their payments to Morrison's personal accounts. The Admiral also learned that Morrison had a history of discriminatory behavior toward female and minority service members. Previous complaints had been filed but not fully investigated, and there was a pattern of qualified personnel being transferred or pushed out of Morrison's command after reporting problems. As the investigation expanded, Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm. Military reporters and veterans advocates sought her out for interviews, but Walsh advised her to remain silent until the legal proceedings were complete. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had always preferred to work quietly behind the scenes. Sarah's family struggled to understand the complexities of military justice and the political forces at work. Her parents had immigrated to America believing in the fairness of American institutions, and they were shocked to discover that corruption and discrimination could exist at the highest levels of the military. Her father, David Chen, took leave from the family restaurant to attend every hearing and meeting related to Sarah's case. He sat quietly in the back of courtrooms and conference rooms, his presence a reminder of the sacrifices that immigrant families make for their children's opportunities in America. The case also attracted attention from Asian American advocacy groups and women's rights organizations, who saw Sarah's treatment as part of a larger pattern of discrimination in the military. They organized letter-writing campaigns and peaceful protests outside the naval base, calling for the charges to be dropped and for Morrison to be held accountable for his actions. Webb himself was in an agonizing position. He had been ordered not to speak publicly about the case, but privately he was tormented by the knowledge that the person who saved his life was being punished for her heroism. Webb had nightmares about the incident, and his wife reported that he often woke up gasping for air, reliving the moments when he had nearly drowned. Webb's SEAL teammates were equally frustrated by their inability to speak out publicly. They had signed non-disclosure agreements as part of their security clearances, and violating those agreements could result in criminal charges and the loss of their clearances. However, Martinez was quietly working to find a way around these restrictions. The breakthrough came when Walsh discovered that Morrison had violated several regulations in filing the charges against Sarah. He had failed to conduct a proper preliminary investigation, had not allowed Sarah to have a representative present during her initial questioning, and had submitted false statements to higher command about the circumstances of the rescue. These procedural violations gave Walsh grounds to request that all charges be dismissed, but she knew that Morrison would fight to keep the case alive. He was too invested in the outcome to back down easily, and his own career was now tied to the successful prosecution of Sarah's case. The tension on the base was palpable as both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be a decisive confrontation. Morrison had the backing of some old-school officers who believed that military discipline required strict adherence to protocol regardless of the circumstances. However, he was facing opposition from a growing coalition of service members who saw Sarah's case as a test of military values and honor. Walsh prepared her defense strategy carefully, knowing that she was not just defending Sarah, but challenging a system that allowed political considerations to override justice. She gathered expert witnesses who could testify about rescue procedures and medical protocols, and she prepared to expose Morrison's misconduct in detail. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the base's main courtroom. Walsh expected a routine proceeding where she would present her motion to dismiss the charges, but Martinez and his fellow SEALs had other plans. 3 days before the hearing, Martinez received word that Naval Intelligence had completed its investigation of Morrison and was preparing to file charges against him for fraud and corruption. The timing was perfect for what Martinez had in mind, but it would require unprecedented coordination and absolute secrecy. Martinez reached out to every SEAL he could contact, both active duty and retired, and shared his plan. The response was immediate and overwhelming. They were all in. What Martinez was proposing had never been done before in military history, but the situation called for extraordinary measures. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. On the day of Sarah's hearing, a group of SEALs would gather at the base and make their way to the courtroom. They would not speak or interfere with the proceedings, but their presence would send a clear message about where the special operations community stood on the charges against Sarah. The logistics were challenging because many of the SEALs were stationed at different bases or deployed overseas, but Martinez worked tirelessly to coordinate their arrival. He called in favors from transportation units and used his connections throughout the military to arrange leave and travel for as many SEALs as possible. Word of the plan spread through unofficial channels, and soon other special operations units were asking to participate. Martinez had to balance the desire for a strong showing of support with the need to maintain operational security and avoid giving Morrison advance warning of what was coming. As the hearing date approached, tension on the base continued to build. Morrison seemed increasingly agitated and paranoid, apparently sensing that forces beyond his control were aligning against him. He increased security around his office and began limiting access to case files and witness statements. Sarah remained focused on her daily duties at the base clinic, but she could feel the weight of expectations from the people who were supporting her. She had never asked to be a symbol or a cause, but she understood that her case had become about more than just her own future. The night before the hearing, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her quarters. Senior Chief Martinez stood at her door in his dress uniform. his chest heavy with ribbons and decorations earned in combat zones around the world. He had come to tell her something that would change everything she thought she knew about military brotherhood and honor. Martinez explained that he and his fellow SEALs had been watching the case closely, and they had decided that they couldn't stand by while injustice was being done in their name. He told Sarah that she had acted with the kind of courage and selflessness that defined the best of military service, and that her actions had embodied the SEAL motto, "The only easy day was yesterday." He also revealed something that Sarah had not known. Webb had been secretly fighting the charges against her from the beginning. Despite being ordered to remain silent, Webb had been working behind the scenes to gather evidence of Morrison's misconduct and to coordinate with naval intelligence in their investigation. Martinez told Sarah that she wouldn't be walking into that courtroom alone, and that the SEAL community stood behind her completely. What he didn't tell her was the specific nature of the demonstration they had planned, because he wanted her reaction to be genuine when she saw what was waiting for her. As Sarah tried to sleep that night, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had joined the Navy to serve her country and help others, and despite everything that had happened, she still believed in those values. Tomorrow would determine whether the military she loved could live up to its own highest ideals, or whether politics and corruption would triumph over honor and justice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered in military history. Sarah Chen had no idea that she was about to become the center of the most powerful demonstration of military solidarity ever witnessed, or that her case would ultimately bring down one of the most corrupt officers in naval history. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind blowing across the naval base. Sarah woke before her alarm, her stomach churning with nervousness and anticipation. She had barely slept, running through possible scenarios in her mind and trying to prepare for whatever the day might bring. She dressed carefully in her service dress blue uniform, making sure every detail was perfect. The irony was not lost on her that she was wearing the same uniform that might be stripped from her by the end of the day. As she looked at herself in the mirror, Sarah saw not just a sailor facing charges, but a young woman whose entire future hung in the balance. Lieutenant Walsh had arranged to meet Sarah at the base legal office an hour before the hearing to go over final preparations. As Sarah walked across the base, she noticed that something felt different. There seemed to be more activity than usual for a Thursday morning, with personnel moving purposefully toward the administrative complex where the courtroom was located. Walsh was waiting with a stack of files and documents that represented weeks of investigation and preparation. She looked confident but tense, and Sarah could see the weight of responsibility in her eyes. Walsh knew that this case would likely define her career as a military lawyer, regardless of the outcome. The defense attorney had prepared thoroughly for every possible scenario, but she was particularly excited about some last-minute evidence that had arrived the previous evening. Naval intelligence had provided her with financial records that clearly showed Morrison's pattern of corruption, and they had also given her permission to present evidence that would expose his discriminatory behavior toward female and minority service members. As they reviewed the key points of Walsh's presentation, Sarah felt a mixture of hope and dread. The evidence seemed overwhelming in her favor, but she had learned not to underestimate Morrison's ability to manipulate the system to his advantage. Meanwhile, Senior Chief Martinez was coordinating the final details of the demonstration that he and his fellow SEALs had planned. Beginning at dawn, special operations personnel had been arriving at the base from stations across the country and around the world. They came quietly and individually, checking in at the visitors center and making their way to predetermined assembly points. The SEALs had planned meticulously to avoid detection by Morrison's staff. They used personal leave and travel orders to justify their presence, and they coordinated their arrival times to avoid creating obvious patterns that might alert base security. Martinez had recruited not just active duty SEALs, but also retired operators who had maintained their base access privileges. The response had been overwhelming, with more volunteers than he could accommodate. Some had flown in from as far away as Europe and Asia, using their own money to purchase last-minute airline tickets. The group included some of the most decorated warriors in American military history. Master Chief Robert Hayes, a legend in the SEAL community who had served in every major conflict of the past 3 decades, had driven through the night from his home in Virginia to be present. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Williams, one of the first women to complete SEAL training, had taken emergency leave from her assignment in Japan. As the hearing time approached, these elite warriors began making their way toward the administrative building where the courtroom was located. They moved in small groups, wearing their dress uniforms and maintaining the professional bearing that had been drilled into them through years of military service. Captain Morrison arrived at his office early that morning, apparently unaware of the forces gathering against him. He had spent the previous week trying to shore up support for his position and preparing for what he expected would be a routine hearing. Morrison believed that military discipline and his authority as commanding officer would carry the day, regardless of the evidence in Sarah's favor. Morrison's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, had tried repeatedly to convince him to drop the charges, but Morrison was too invested in the outcome to back down. His own legal troubles were mounting, and he saw Sarah's prosecution as his last chance to demonstrate that he was in control of his command. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the base's main courtroom, a formal space with dark wood paneling and military portraits lining the walls. The room could accommodate about 50 people, and Morrison expected only a handful of attendees: the legal teams, court personnel, and perhaps a few curious staff members. At 9:30, Sarah and Walsh made their way to the courtroom, walking along the covered walkway that connected the legal offices to the administrative building. Sarah noticed that there seemed to be an unusual number of people in dress uniforms moving in the same direction, but she assumed they were attending other meetings or hearings. As they approached the building, Walsh pointed out the media representatives who had gathered outside. Several military reporters and local news crews were setting up cameras and interviewing base personnel, drawn by the growing attention that Sarah's case had attracted. Walsh had expected some media interest, but she was surprised by the scale of the coverage. What neither Sarah nor Walsh knew was that Martinez had carefully tipped off selected media contacts about the demonstration that was about to take place. He wanted to ensure that the sealed show of support would be captured on camera and shared with the world, but he had been careful to maintain operational security by only providing general information about the timing and location. Inside the administrative building, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Court personnel were making final preparations, and a few early arrivals had taken seats in the gallery. Morrison entered through a side door, accompanied by his legal team and looking confident despite the pressure he was facing. At 9:55, Sarah and Walsh entered the courtroom through the main entrance. Sarah was struck by how formal and intimidating the space felt, with its high ceiling and solemn atmosphere. She took her seat at the defense table and tried to calm her nerves by focusing on Walsh's final preparations. Morrison glanced over at Sarah with undisguised hostility. Throughout the investigation and legal proceedings, he had shown no remorse for the charges he had filed, or consideration for the impact they were having on Sarah's life and career. To Morrison, Sarah represented a challenge to his authority that had to be crushed, regardless of the circumstances. The military judge, Captain Elizabeth Foster, entered the courtroom at exactly 10 o'clock. Foster was known for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for theatrics or political grandstanding. She had reviewed the case files carefully and was prepared to make decisions based on military law and evidence, not on the personal agendas of the parties involved. As Judge Foster called the hearing to order, Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This was the culmination of months of investigation, preparation, and anxiety. In the next few hours, her entire future would be determined by the decisions made in this room. Walsh rose to present her motion to dismiss the charges, outlining the procedural violations that Morrison had committed and presenting evidence of his ulterior motives in filing the case. She spoke clearly and persuasively, building a compelling case that the charges against Sarah were not just unfounded, but represented an abuse of military justice. As Walsh spoke, neither she nor Sarah noticed the unusual activity beginning to take place outside the courtroom. Small groups of personnel in dress uniforms were quietly gathering in the hallways and common areas of the administrative building. They moved with purpose but without urgency, maintaining the disciplined bearing that marked them as elite military professionals. Martinez had coordinated the timing perfectly. As Walsh reached the climax of her presentation, exposing Morrison's financial misconduct and discriminatory behavior, the SEALs began moving toward the building's main entrance. They had timed their approach to coincide with the end of the morning session, when Sarah would be walking back to the legal offices. The first sign that something unusual was happening came when a base security officer knocked on the courtroom door and whispered something to the bailiff. Judge Foster paused the proceedings briefly, apparently receiving information about some kind of gathering outside the building. Morrison looked concerned for the first time that morning. He had been monitoring radio chatter throughout the hearing and was beginning to suspect that something was happening beyond his control. His legal team exchanged worried glances as reports filtered in about large numbers of personnel gathering near the administrative building. Walsh concluded her presentation with a powerful statement about military justice and the importance of protecting service members who act with courage and honor in crisis situations. She called for all charges against Sarah to be dismissed and for Morrison to be held accountable for his abuse of authority.
Judge Foster announced a brief recess to review the motions and evidence that had been presented. She indicated that she would render her decision after lunch, giving both sides time to prepare their closing arguments. As the court adjourned for the morning session, Sarah felt a mixture of hope and exhaustion. As Sarah and Walsh prepared to leave the courtroom, Martinez's plan moved into its final phase. The senior chief had positioned himself near the main entrance of the administrative building, and he gave a subtle signal that was passed through the ranks of assembled SEALs. Sarah walked out of the courtroom feeling drained by the morning's proceedings but cautiously optimistic about Walsh's presentation. She was focused on the afternoon session and didn't immediately notice the unusual number of personnel gathered in the building's lobby and corridors. It was only when Sarah stepped outside that she realized something extraordinary was happening. The covered walkway that led back to the legal offices was lined with Navy SEALs standing at attention in their dress uniforms. The sight was so unexpected and powerful that Sarah stopped in her tracks, unable to process what she was seeing. Martinez stood at the front of the formation, his weathered face showing a mixture of pride and determination. Behind him, stretching along both sides of the walkway, were 37 of America's most elite warriors. They represented decades of combined combat experience and embodied the highest values of military service. As Sarah stared in amazement at the formation of SEALs, she realized that this was more than just a show of support. It was a statement about military honor and the bonds that connect service members who are committed to protecting each other and upholding the values they have sworn to defend. The media representatives who had been waiting outside immediately began filming and photographing the unprecedented scene. In all their years of covering military affairs, none of them had witnessed anything like the spontaneous demonstration of solidarity that was unfolding before their eyes. Sarah began walking slowly along the pathway, with Walsh beside her and the SEALs maintaining their positions of attention. The silence was profound and moving, broken only by the sound of footsteps on concrete and the clicking of camera shutters. As she passed each SEAL, Sarah made eye contact and nodded in recognition of their sacrifice and support. Many of these warriors had risked their own careers by participating in the demonstration, but they had decided that some principles were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. Martinez fell into step behind Sarah as she passed his position, and one by one, the other SEALs joined the procession. What had begun as a formation became a parade, with Sarah leading a line of elite warriors who had chosen to make their support visible to the world. The image of the small Navy medic walking confidently while accompanied by 37 Navy SEALs was captured by photographers and immediately shared across social media platforms. Within hours, the photograph would be seen by millions of people around the world, becoming a symbol of military honor and the power of standing up for what is right. As the procession reached the legal offices, Sarah turned to face the SEALs who had supported her. Fighting back tears, she managed to say a simple thank you that carried the weight of all her emotions. The SEALs responded with a silent salute that spoke louder than any words could have. The demonstration had lasted only a few minutes, but its impact would be felt for years to come. Sarah Chen had walked that pathway expecting to face the afternoon session alone and uncertain. Instead, she had experienced the most powerful show of military brotherhood in modern history, and she knew that whatever happened in the courtroom, she had already won something far more valuable than legal vindication. The afternoon session convened in an atmosphere completely transformed from the morning proceedings. Word of the SEAL demonstration had spread throughout the base within minutes, and the courtroom was now packed with military personnel, media representatives, and civilian observers who had gained access to witness what many were calling a historic moment in military justice. Judge Foster entered the courtroom with a stern expression that revealed nothing about her reaction to the morning's events. She had spent the lunch recess reviewing not only the legal motions before her, but also reports about the unprecedented demonstration that had taken place outside her courtroom. Foster understood that her decision would be scrutinized far beyond the confines of military legal proceedings. Captain Morrison appeared shaken by the show of support for Sarah. His legal team had briefed him about the SEAL formation, and he seemed to finally understand that he was facing opposition far more formidable than a single Navy medic and her attorney. The confident bearing he had displayed in the morning had been replaced by visible anxiety and frequent whispered consultations with his lawyers. Sarah sat at the defense table with renewed confidence, still moved by the powerful demonstration of solidarity she had witnessed. The image of those elite warriors standing in formation would be burned into her memory forever, and she knew that, regardless of the legal outcome, she had already received validation of her actions from the people whose opinions mattered most. Lieutenant Walsh was prepared to present additional evidence that had emerged during the lunch break, but she sensed that the momentum had shifted decisively in their favor. The SEAL demonstration had accomplished something that legal arguments alone could not achieve.
It had made clear that the special operations community viewed Morrison's charges as an attack on their values and their people. Judge Foster called the court to order and immediately addressed the morning's events. She acknowledged that she was aware of the demonstration that had taken place and stated that while she respected the service members' right to express their support, her decision would be based solely on the legal merits of the case and applicable military regulations. However, Foster's tone suggested that she had been deeply affected by what she had witnessed. The sight of 37 Navy SEALs risking their careers to support a fellow service member had sent a message about military honor that transcended any legal arguments that might be presented in her courtroom. Walsh rose to present additional evidence that had been provided by naval intelligence during the lunch break. The timing of the release was not coincidental. Admiral Clark had decided that Morrison's legal troubles could no longer be kept separate from Sarah's case, and he had authorized the disclosure of information that would expose the full scope of Morrison's corruption. The evidence was devastating. Financial records showed that Morrison had accepted over $200,000 in kickbacks from defense contractors over a period of 18 months. He had used his position to steer contracts to companies that provided him with personal benefits, including expensive vacations, home improvements, and payments to his legal team during his divorce proceedings. Even more damaging were personnel records that revealed Morrison's pattern of discriminatory behavior. Walsh presented evidence of 14 separate incidents in which Morrison had taken punitive action against female or minority service members, often on pretextual grounds that would not survive serious scrutiny. The record showed that Morrison had repeatedly blocked promotions for qualified women and minorities while advancing the careers of white male officers who were demonstrably less qualified. He had created a hostile work environment that had driven several talented service members to request transfers or leave the military entirely. Perhaps most shocking was evidence that Morrison had attempted to cover up a sexual assault case involving one of his senior staff members. When a female petty officer had reported being assaulted by a lieutenant commander, Morrison had pressured her to withdraw the complaint and had subsequently transferred her to a less desirable assignment while taking no action against her alleged attacker. As Walsh presented each piece of evidence, Morrison slumped further in his chair. His legal team made occasional objections, but they appeared to understand that their client's position was becoming untenable. The corruption and misconduct revealed by naval intelligence went far beyond anything that could be explained away by administrative errors or personality conflicts. Judge Foster listened to the evidence with increasing gravity, occasionally asking pointed questions about the timeline of Morrison's actions and the scope of his misconduct. It became clear that she was not just evaluating the charges against Sarah, but considering the broader implications of Morrison's abuse of authority. The prosecution's case, which had always been weak, crumbled completely under the weight of the new evidence. Morrison's attorney attempted to argue that his client's personal problems were irrelevant to the specific charges against Sarah, but Foster rejected this argument decisively. The judge pointed out that Morrison's pattern of corruption and discrimination was directly relevant to his motives for filing charges against Sarah. The evidence suggested that Morrison had used the military justice system as a weapon against service members who posed a threat to his interests or who failed to conform to his personal prejudices. When Morrison's attorney tried to present character witnesses to support their client, Walsh objected on the grounds that Morrison's character was precisely what was at issue in the case. Foster sustained the objection and limited the defense to arguing the narrow legal issues surrounding the charges against Sarah. As the afternoon progressed, it became increasingly clear that Morrison had overplayed his hand catastrophically. By targeting Sarah Chen, he had united the special operations community against him and triggered an investigation that exposed the full scope of his corruption. What he had intended as a distraction from his personal problems had instead become the catalyst for his downfall. The most powerful moment of the afternoon came when Lieutenant Commander Webb was called as a surprise witness for the defense. Webb had been granted permission to testify by Admiral Clark, who had determined that the truth was more important than Morrison's attempts to silence witnesses. Webb entered the courtroom in his dress uniform, walking with the quiet confidence that marked him as one of America's elite warriors. His presence caused a stir among the observers, many of whom knew that he owed his life to Sarah's actions during the rescue operation. Walsh asked Webb to describe the incident that had led to the charges against Sarah, and his testimony was clear and unambiguous. He stated that Sarah had acted with extraordinary courage and skill, and that her decision to enter the water without waiting for additional equipment had saved his life. Webb's voice broke slightly as he described the moments when he was unconscious and not breathing, knowing that Sarah was fighting to keep him alive while struggling to stay afloat herself. He testified that Sarah's actions were exactly what he would have expected from any SEAL in the same situation, and that her quick thinking and persistence had made the difference between life and death. Most importantly, Webb testified that he had never been consulted about the charges against Sarah and that he completely disagreed with Morrison's decision to prosecute her. He stated that honoring Sarah for her heroism would have been the appropriate response, not subjecting her to a court-martial for conduct unbecoming. When Morrison's attorney attempted to cross-examine Webb, the SEAL commander's responses were devastating. Webb calmly and methodically destroyed every argument that the prosecution had made, pointing out the absurdity of claiming that saving a life constituted misconduct. Webb also revealed that Morrison had attempted to pressure him to modify his witness statement to be less favorable to Sarah. According to Webb, Morrison had suggested that his memory might be unreliable due to his near-death experience and had implied that supporting Sarah could have negative consequences for Webb's career. The revelation that Morrison had attempted to suborn perjury from the victim of the incident was the final blow to his credibility. Judge Foster's expression showed her disgust with Morrison's conduct, and his own attorney appeared to be reconsidering their strategy. As Webb concluded his testimony, he made an unprecedented request. He asked Judge Foster for permission to make a personal statement about the broader issues raised by the case. Foster granted the request, understanding that Webb's words would carry enormous weight given his status and his personal connection to the events. Webb stood and faced the gallery, addressing not just the court but the broader military community that was following the case. He spoke about the values that had drawn him to special operations and the bonds that connected all service members who were committed to protecting each other and the American people. Webb stated that Sarah Chen embodied everything that was best about military service: courage under fire, selflessness in the face of danger, and unwavering commitment to saving lives regardless of personal cost. He argued that prosecuting her for these actions sent a message that the military valued conformity over courage and bureaucracy over brotherhood. Most powerfully, Webb declared that every SEAL he knew would have acted exactly as Sarah did in the same situation, and that they all understood that military regulations existed to serve the mission, not to prevent service members from doing what was necessary to save lives. When Webb finished speaking, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of cameras capturing a moment that would be remembered as a defining statement about military honor and values. Even Morrison appeared moved by Webb's words, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done. Judge Foster called for a brief recess before rendering her decision, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The evidence of Morrison's corruption and misconduct, combined with the overwhelming support for Sarah from the special operations community, had made it impossible for the charges to stand. During the recess, Admiral Clark arrived at the courthouse, accompanied by representatives from Naval Intelligence. Clark had been monitoring the proceedings throughout the day and had decided that the case required his personal attention given its implications for military justice and public confidence in Navy leadership. Clark's presence sent a clear signal that Navy leadership was taking the case seriously and was prepared to take decisive action to address the misconduct that had been exposed. His arrival also suggested that Morrison's career was over and that criminal charges were likely to follow. As the court reconvened for Judge Foster's decision, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Sarah sat quietly at the defense table, supported by Walsh, and surrounded by the knowledge that some of the military's most elite warriors had put their careers on the line to support her. Morrison appeared to have aged years in the course of the day, his face drawn and his confident demeanor completely gone. He seemed to understand that he was about to face not just a legal defeat, but the complete destruction of his career and reputation. Judge Foster entered the courtroom for the final time that day, carrying herself with the gravity appropriate to a decision that would resonate far beyond the military justice system. As she prepared to render her verdict, everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered as a turning point in military culture and justice. The stage was set for a conclusion that would vindicate Sarah Chen and expose the corruption that had threatened to destroy an innocent service member's career. More importantly, it would demonstrate that military honor and brotherhood could triumph over political manipulation and personal ambition, even in the face of overwhelming institutional pressure. Judge Foster took her seat with the bearing of an officer who understood that her words would echo far beyond the confines of the courtroom. The gallery was packed with military personnel, media representatives, and observers who recognized that they were about to witness a pivotal moment in military justice. The silence was absolute as Foster prepared to render her decision. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Foster began, her voice clear and authoritative. I find the charges against Petty Officer Second Class Sarah Chen to be not only without merit but fundamentally contrary to the values and principles that define military service. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the courtroom, though Sarah herself remained motionless,
hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Foster continued with devastating precision, methodically dismantling every aspect of the prosecution's case. She noted that Sarah's actions during the rescue had been exemplary in every respect and represented the highest traditions of naval service. The judge stated unequivocally that saving Webb's life was not just appropriate but represented exactly the kind of initiative and courage that the military should celebrate and promote. More damaging to Morrison was Foster's analysis of his conduct throughout the case. She described his actions as a systematic abuse of authority, designed to deflect attention from his own misconduct while destroying the career of an exemplary service member. Foster noted that Morrison's attempt to prosecute Sarah represented a fundamental perversion of the military justice system. The judge's most scathing comments concerned Morrison's pattern of discrimination and corruption. Foster stated that the evidence revealed a commanding officer who had lost sight of his fundamental duty to protect and develop the service members under his command. She described Morrison's behavior as antithetical to military honor and destructive to good order and discipline. Foster announced that all charges against Sarah were dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be refiled. She further ordered that Sarah's service record be cleared of any reference to the charges and that she be restored to full duty status immediately. The judge also recommended that Sarah be considered for appropriate recognition for her heroic actions during the rescue. As Foster's words sank in, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she had carried for months. The relief was so overwhelming that she had to steady herself against the defense table, supported by Lieutenant Walsh's reassuring hand on her arm. But Judge Foster was not finished. In an unprecedented move, she announced that she was referring Morrison's conduct to the appropriate authorities for investigation of potential criminal charges. Foster stated that the evidence of corruption, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority warranted a full criminal investigation by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Morrison's face went pale as he realized that his legal troubles were just beginning. What had started as his attempt to destroy Sarah's career had ended with the complete destruction of his own future and the likelihood of criminal prosecution. Admiral Clark rose from his seat in the gallery and requested permission to address the court. Foster granted the request, recognizing the significance of having Pacific Fleet's commanding officer present for the proceedings. Clark spoke directly to Sarah, expressing his personal apologies for the injustice she had endured and his admiration for her courage throughout the ordeal. He announced that Sarah would be reassigned to Special Operations medical training and that the Navy would fully support her career advancement going forward. The Admiral also announced Morrison's immediate relief from command and his suspension from all duties pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Clark made clear that the Navy would take whatever steps were necessary to ensure that Morrison's victims received justice and that similar abuses could not happen in the future. As the formal proceedings concluded, Sarah was surrounded by well-wishers and supporters who had filled the courtroom. The Navy SEALs who had participated in the morning demonstration approached her one by one, offering congratulations and expressing their pride in her courage and determination. Senior Chief Martinez was among the last to speak with Sarah, and his words carried special meaning given the role he had played in organizing the demonstration that had helped turn the tide in her favor. Martinez told Sarah that she had proven herself worthy of serving alongside America's elite warriors and that she would always be considered part of the SEAL family. Lieutenant Commander Webb approached Sarah with visible emotion, finally able to express his gratitude for her actions and his regret about the ordeal she had been forced to endure. Webb thanked Sarah for saving his life and apologized for not being able to speak out sooner in her defense. The two service members embraced briefly, a moment that captured the bonds that connect those who serve together and sacrifice for each other. Webb promised that he would do everything in his power to ensure that Sarah's heroism was properly recognized and that her career continued to flourish. Outside the courthouse, Sarah faced a crowd of media representatives eager to capture her reaction to the day's events. With Walsh at her side, Sarah spoke briefly about her gratitude for the support she had received and her continued commitment to serving her country and saving lives. Sarah's parents, who had flown in from California to be present for the decision, stood proudly beside their daughter as she addressed the media. David Chen, who had never fully understood the American military system, now saw clearly that his daughter had been vindicated by the same values of honor and justice that had drawn his family to America. The story of Sarah's case and the SEAL demonstration spread rapidly through traditional media and social networks, becoming a global symbol of military honor and the power of standing up for what is right. The image of Sarah walking confidently while surrounded by elite warriors became one of the most shared photographs in military history. Within weeks, the case had prompted congressional hearings on military justice and discrimination in the armed forces,
Lawmakers from both parties praised Sarah's courage and criticized the systemic failures that had allowed Morrison's misconduct to continue unchecked. The Navy responded by implementing new policies to prevent similar abuses and to better protect service members who report misconduct or face retaliation. Admiral Clark appointed Sarah to a special advisory committee tasked with developing these reforms, recognizing her unique perspective and moral authority on these issues. Morrison's criminal trial began 6 months later, with prosecutors presenting evidence of fraud, corruption, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. The case became a textbook example of how unchecked power and personal prejudice could corrupt military leadership. During the trial, additional victims of Morrison's misconduct came forward, revealing an even broader pattern of abuse than had been exposed during Sarah's case. Morrison was ultimately convicted on multiple felony charges and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, becoming one of the highest-ranking naval officers ever court-martialed for corruption. Sarah's story became required reading at military leadership schools, used as an example of moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. Her case study was incorporated into training programs for officers and senior enlisted personnel, emphasizing the importance of protecting subordinates and maintaining ethical standards regardless of personal cost. The Navy SEALs who had participated in the demonstration faced no disciplinary action, with Admiral Clark noting that their actions had been consistent with the highest traditions of military honor. Several of the participants were subsequently promoted, with their support for Sarah cited as evidence of their commitment to military values. Senior Chief Martinez retired 2 years later with full honors, his career capped by recognition for his leadership in defending military justice and honor. At his retirement ceremony, he was presented with a special commendation signed by Sarah, acknowledging his role in ensuring that courage and righteousness prevailed over corruption and prejudice. Sarah herself was promoted ahead of schedule and selected for advanced medical training at some of the military's most prestigious institutions. She specialized in combat trauma medicine and became one of the Navy's leading experts in emergency medical procedures under extreme conditions. 5 years after the incident that nearly destroyed her career, Sarah was commissioned as an officer and assigned to lead medical teams supporting special operations missions around the world. She had achieved her childhood dream of becoming a doctor, earning her medical degree through military programs while continuing to serve actively. The rescue that had started Sarah's ordeal became the foundation for new training protocols that emphasized the importance of immediate action in life-threatening situations. Sarah's techniques were incorporated into standard rescue procedures, and her case was used to train medical personnel in making critical decisions under pressure. Webb, who had recovered completely from his diving accident, went on to command his own SEAL team and eventually became one of the Navy's youngest commanding officers. He remained close friends with Sarah throughout their careers, and he frequently spoke about how her courage had inspired him to be a better leader and a better person. The relationship between Sarah and the SEAL community grew stronger over time, with many units requesting her services for training exercises and deployments. She became known throughout the special operations community as Doc Chen, a term of respect reserved for medical personnel who had proven themselves under fire. Sarah's parents eventually understood that their daughter had found her true calling in military service. They were enormously proud of her achievements and the recognition she had received, but they were most proud of the fact that she had never compromised her principles despite tremendous pressure to do so. The restaurant that Sarah's parents owned became something of a shrine to military service, with walls covered by photographs and memorabilia from Sarah's career. Veterans from all branches of the military would stop by when visiting the area, drawn by stories of the family's commitment to honor and service. Sarah herself rarely spoke publicly about the case that had made her famous, preferring to focus on her current duties and responsibilities. However, she occasionally accepted speaking engagements at military academies and leadership conferences, where her story continued to inspire new generations of service members. When she did speak about her experiences, Sarah emphasized that she had simply done what any competent medic would have done in the same situation. She credited the support of her fellow service members, particularly the Navy SEALs, with enabling her to persevere through the darkest period of her career. The case fundamentally changed how the military approached issues of discrimination and retaliation, leading to stronger protections for whistleblowers and more rigorous oversight of commanding officers. Sarah's ordeal had exposed weaknesses in the system that might never have been addressed without her unwilling sacrifice. More importantly, the case demonstrated that military honor and brotherhood could triumph over corruption and prejudice when good people were willing to take risks to defend what was right. The image of 37 Navy SEALs standing with Sarah Chen became a lasting symbol of the values that define the best of military service. As Sarah continued her career, she carried with her the knowledge that she had not just survived an attempt to destroy her life, but had helped make the military a more just and honorable institution.
Her courage in the face of injustice had created ripple effects that would protect countless other service members for generations to come. The story of Sarah Chen and her walk with the Navy SEALs would be remembered as long as there were warriors willing to fight for justice and honor. It proved that even in the darkest moments, when institutional power is arrayed against individual courage, righteousness can still prevail when good people refuse to stand by and watch injustice triumph. In the end, Sarah's case demonstrated that true strength lies not in rank or authority, but in the willingness to do what is right regardless of the consequences. Her legacy would inspire future generations of military personnel to stand up for their fellow service members and to never compromise their principles in the face of corruption or prejudice. The walk that Sarah took with 37 Navy SEALs behind her became more than just a moment of support. It became a defining statement about the values that make military service a noble calling and a sacred trust.